Fishing is supposed to be peaceful. Long stretches of silence. The sound of water moving slowly, time passing without urgency. That's why the things that happen out there feel so wrong. When something breaks that calm, there's nowhere to hide and no one around to hear you if something goes wrong. The first story comes from a man who used to fish alone on a small river just outside his hometown. He went there late one evening just before sunset. It was a spot he'd been visiting since he was a teenager, far from roads or houses. To get there, he had to park his truck on a dirt pull-off and hike about 15 minutes through trees and tall grass. By the time he reached the riverbank, the sky was already starting to darken. For the first hour, nothing happened. No bites, no movement except the slow current and insects hovering over the water. Then he noticed something on the opposite bank. At first, he thought it was a deer, something tall and still, partially hidden by reeds. But when it moved, it didn't move like an animal. It stepped forward, slowly upright. He froze, keeping his eyes locked on it. The figure didn't approach the water. It just stood there, facing him across the river. He couldn't make out details, only a dark outline against the fading light. He called out, assuming it might be another fisherman. No response. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. It didn't cast a line. It didn't crouch or adjust its footing. It just stood there. That's when he realized something worse. He couldn't hear it moving at all. No footsteps, no rustling grass, just silence. As the sun fully disappeared, the figure finally shifted. Instead of turning away, it stepped closer to the water. The distance between them was closing. That was enough. He reeled in his line without taking his eyes off it and slowly backed away. When he reached the tree line behind him, he turned and ran. When he looked back one last time, the opposite bank was empty. The next morning, curiosity got the better of him. He went back in daylight. On the opposite bank, exactly where the figure had stood, there were no footprints, no broken grass, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. He never fished that river again. The second story comes from a group of friends on a late-night fishing trip at a remote lake. There were 4 of them, all in their 20s, and they had driven several hours to reach the lake. It was surrounded by forest, with no cell service and no nearby campsites. They arrived just before midnight, planning to fish through the night and leave at sunrise. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. They joked, drank coffee, and kept their lines in the water. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars above. Sometime around 2 a.m., one of them noticed ripples near the center of the lake. Not the usual circular ripples from fish. These were long, slow waves, like something large was moving just beneath the surface. They watched in silence as the ripples drifted closer to shore. Then the water broke. Something surfaced briefly, just long enough for them to see a pale shape beneath the water, larger than any fish they'd ever seen in that lake. Then it disappeared again, leaving the water unnaturally still. They tried to laugh it off, telling themselves it was just a large fish or debris, but none of them cast their lines back out. A few minutes later, they heard splashing behind them, not in the water, in the trees. Heavy footsteps, moving slowly along the shoreline, circling them. Whoever or whatever it was stayed just out of sight, moving where the trees were thickest. One of them shouted, asking who was there. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then from across the lake, they heard something mimic the shout. Same tone, same voice, slightly distorted. That's when panic set in. They grabbed their gear and ran for the car. As they drove away, one of them looked back and saw something standing at the edge of the water, watching the headlights fade. Tall, still, silent. They never spoke about it again after that night. The third story comes from a man who had been fishing offshore, miles from land. He was an experienced fisherman and often went out alone on his small boat before sunrise. One morning he traveled farther than usual, chasing what he thought would be a better catch. By the time the sun rose, he realized how isolated he really was. No other boats, no birds, just open water in every direction. About an hour into fishing, he felt a strong pull on his line, stronger than anything he'd experienced before. The rod bent sharply and the line screamed as something pulled downward. He fought it for several minutes, struggling to keep control. Whatever was on the other end wasn't moving like a fish. It wasn't darting or changing direction. It was pulling straight down, steadily, as if testing him. Then it stopped. The line went slack. Confused, he started reeling in. When the hook broke the surface, there was nothing on it. No bait, no hook. The entire end of the line had been cleanly severed. As he stared at it, trying to understand what could have cut it so cleanly, he noticed movement in the water beside his boat. Something dark passed beneath him, just under the surface. Long, wide, slow. The water shifted, rocking the boat gently. He reached for the engine controls, but before he could start it, he heard a sound from below. A dull thud, then another. Something was hitting the underside of the boat. Not randomly, rhythmically. Once. Pause. Once. Pause. He started the engine immediately and sped away without looking back. When he got home and inspected the boat, there were deep marks along the hull. Not scratches, dents, as if something solid had struck it from below. To this day, he refuses to fish offshore alone. Fishing horror doesn't come from monsters jumping out of the water. It comes from isolation, from silence, from realizing that when you're standing at the edge of a river, a lake, or the open sea, you're not just watching the water. Something might be watching you too.